Forwards, futures, opzioni.
Forwards, futures, options, all the topics which remind us of the years when computers were introduced and when we all felt rich. It was the late 80s and globalization was coming into its own thanks to the network. In that situation, we started having all the family of products, including derivatives, financial products which have to do with the other financial activities. For example, option contracts are based on stock, but not on real commodities. It gives you the right to buy or sell a given activity on a given date, which in the mathematical formulas which are used to calculate its date is called T, at a given price K. Futures and forwards are usually employed to block the price of a good for a given period of time. Each and every decision that investors make are linked to very complex mathematical calculations, which at one time meant that brokers were holding on to the phone and talking into it, but now it's automatic and computers. But this automation has meant that market fluctuations are not easily managed. Some of the parallel markets are not exactly the stock exchanges, but the over-the-counter, which are not really regulated and established by professionals with telematic networks. A forward is an agreement between two parties to purchase or sell at a given price and a given date in the future. The main risk of a forward contract is that one of the two parties should not honor the commitment, and which means that if you change when you're going to buy or sell, the value of these will change. Futures are forward buying, but within the stock exchange. This has led to, and they have led to a number of controversial discussions because they are prone to they're grown to be very fragile and linked to unforeseen and unforecastable events.
Buonasera, signore e signori qui a Torino. Buonasera, signore e signori.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen here in Turin. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen in Venice, and also the people who are listening to us online. Welcome to you all. This evening, I do not wish to be pessimistic. Some people say that optimists are merely disinformed or uninformed pessimists. I will try to be slightly optimistic, and the title is also a bit optimistic. We said what lies round the corner of the crisis. This means that we hope that we're about to turn a corner. Now, this very complicated address that you can see, it's a Google, but it's a Google website which abbreviates addresses, which is W7RQN, and it's case sensitive, as well as being able to see the podcast of this or to see the slides, because there are some links that can be interesting at that address. But let's start as if it were a detective story. Who done it? Who's really responsible for this big mess that started in 2007? We're now in 2013. And we're still looking at the horizon to see if there are any good signs in the distance. We don't know who done it because it's not easy to identify the guilty parties. We know a lot of people made mistakes and that some people were not in good faith, but most of the problems are in fact due to mistakes or possibly to an overconfidence. That clip was very interesting because it shows us how with formula and computers people are convinced that they can manage the orders of magnitude of the economy, and maybe people were overconfident in these tools, and we're paying for it, and paying for it dearly. The men and women who had nothing to do with computerized stock exchanges are paying for it. I'm starting with something which would seem a joke. Here, if I can see the date, it says that in November 2008, which was a year after the crisis had begun, and the crisis was in full force. So this is the online Daily Telegraph. Here you can see Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh. The Duke of Edinburgh is not really paying attention, but that's not the issue. Now, the Queen that day had gone to inaugurate a new building of LSE. LSE is a prestigious university where you study economics in London. Now, the paper said that some people say, or a lot of people say, that the Queen does her homework and she reads what her specialists and staff had prepared. But then she asked, saying, "Why didn't you tell us about this? Tell us about the disaster that is taking place. Why did nobody notice it?" the Queen asked. Professor Luis Garicano, he's Spanish, who's the director of research at LSE, said what he answered. Because the Queen said, "Why did nobody notice it?" She said she was asking me if these things were so large, how come everybody missed it? And he said to the Queen, at every stage, someone was relying on somebody else and everyone thought they were doing the right thing. But if we all think we're doing the right thing, and one of the links of the chain makes a mistake, the disaster, it's not a crisis, it's a disaster, is around the corner. So now I'll try and explain what mistakes there were. The first mistake are to be attributed to my co-professionals, the economists. A few years ago, a rather lively woman my age accused me of being an economist, as if she were insulting me. We were in a lift and in a U.S. hotel. I was coming down from the 40th floor. The lady walked into the lift too, and she saw that I was part of a conference of economists, and it was the Eastern Economics Association. And I said, "Are you an economist?" She asked me, and I said, "Yes, I am."
Where are you from?
And she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From Italy." "Never mind," she said. She wasn't interested. But had she, in fact, been in the lift with one of the American economists, she would have beaten me to a pulp. And as soon as the lift stopped and the doors opened, I ran away. But a few years ago, well, somebody would have said, "An economist, right? Okay. They might be useful, they might not be useful," and so on. But what was the mistake that we made? Here, you can see a very emblematic image. Can we joke for a moment? Here it says the model of the perfect economic system. And here there are two professors. I'm one of them. And the other one is Professor Fornero. And I am mentioning Professor Fornero because we work in the same department. When she will be coming back and no longer be a minister, we will be very pleased to have her back. Her office is about 10 yards away from mine. And we're looking at our perfect little model of an economic system while there's a businessman who's not really very happy, in fact, who's desperate and is about to crash onto our abstract perfection, will squash our ideal city, and in squashing it, he will kill a number of people. A very important economist, Professor Lucas, who's a very famous economist, in fact, with his work in the 70s, in particular in the mid-70s and in the early 80s, he changed the School of Economics, introducing one of the things which we get our students to study. In fact, we torture them, and it's called the theory of rational expectations. Professor Lucas is a very rigid champion of our profession, and he believes, well, in fact, when he was asked the Queen's question, he said, well, and this is the economist here, if we had a formula that says that next week, Thursday the 6th, if I'm not mistaken, at 4 o'clock there'll be a crisis. Some of you may have seen that wonderful movie of the 60s or 70s, The Universal Judgment, and it said the Universal Judgment will be Friday at 5 o'clock, and it started immediately. The crisis would explode immediately, but that is not what the Queen and other people with a lot of common sense were expecting economists to say. They didn't want a date for the crisis, but they should be able to say what were the dangerous behavior patterns that could have led us to the crisis, and we should have, I include myself, we should have told you in time so that countermeasures could have been taken. Now, what were the mistakes here? Let's talk about it. Well, first thing is that economics are very complicated. Look at these two drawings. The one on the left is serious. The one on the right is a bit of a joke. This is Professor Phillips, who's a great economist, and who in the 70s, in the great 70s, when there was a complete renewal of economics, Phillips carried out his main work in the 60s, but in the 70s, he further developed them. The 70s were very difficult. For those of you who were old enough, they will remember that inflation was very, very high in Italy, and Professor Phillips had studied the balance between inflation and employment, and he had envisaged a machine, a computing machine, the Phillips computing machine. It was an analogic and not a digital. This one did not use electricity but liquids. There are 4 examples of it. One is the British Museum, one in New Zealand, because Professor Phillips was a New Zealander, and I don't know where the other 2 are. Very complicated machine in any case. It never really worked properly, but Punch, that was a very wonderful weekly of satire, that is now bankrupt, tried to open up again, but failed to, and it gave its version of Phillips' computing machine. Here you can see there's somebody running, there's a hot air balloon, there's a hamster running, and economics is a very complex machine. Were it true that there is some gnome that is causing the problems, of course there are very naughty gnomes, but they are more versed in taking advantage of mistakes than in causing the problem themselves. I'm not certainly applauding the people who take advantage of mistakes, but if there were only a few people, a few gnomes that were the guilty party, it would be easier. But what happened with that diabolical system that you saw described a moment ago? People became overconfident, and they believed in formulae. Not all formulae are wrong. Of course, I will also say that there are some economists that were awarded the Nobel Prize last year and that developed a formula that were very important, especially in solving some of the human problems. It's the 2012 Nobel Prize. But here, with the reference to the work that physicists had carried out, and physicists are very good mathematicians, we started assessing risk, imagining that people are atoms or molecules of a gas. Particles. Particles are all the same. If I have a tank full of particles, it's exactly the same whether I study the center or the top left corner or the bottom right corner. There's no difference. So the important thing is that my formula should be properly developed. Physicists also studied perfect gases, and after that they have exceptional results. But economics is not perfect, and people are not all the same, and there is no random distribution of people in space. Be very careful with what I'm about to say now. The disaster that we mentioned and that Dr. Bianucci reminded us of now, of the American mortgage collapses, started with a very good idea, that is to say, houses for all. In the U.S., there is no great market for rent. Normally, people own their houses. In Italy, too, but there is also a good market or rental market. Houses are much cheaper in the States than Italy because they're not as beautiful. They're mainly, I'm not saying disposable, but most of the US houses outside cities are wooden. They're not brick and stone and mortar. But to enable those who were below the threshold, which was required to get the prime mortgages, so the subprimes, they decided to grant people mortgages. And people said it didn't matter because the economy is growing. If they're not going to pay, but they will pay in the future because incomes are going up. And the government was pushing this. So they say, well, if they don't pay, well, they'll lose their house and something will happen again. There was a wave of mortgages in a moment in which there were lots and lots of houses on the market. My mathematical calculation, we should stop at 10%. So say that Bianucci has 10%. We give Professor Mayo 5% risk and not a 10% risk, and so on. So we calculate all the probabilities. I'm oversimplifying, but 10 by 10 by 5, it means a triple A. There's virtually no risk. In any case, we don't expect the three of them to default. That we have 200, 200 will not default. But in fact, that's what happened because the concentration of risk was in the subprime middle class. And at one point, they stopped paying. At that point, these so-called AAA bonds had been sold and resold and resold, aggregated with others. And this started in the Middle Ages, that is to say, to translate the real commodities in paper was something which was invented in the Middle Ages in Tuscany. There's nothing new under the sun here. But one thing is to do it in a rather cautious and controlled manner, and another matter is to do it in cautious. You want an example of caution? People who are my age will remember when, and here in Turin, San Paolo's a long-term bank, had also a number of investment. If I wanted a mortgage, I gave my house as a guarantee, but they would give me at a maximum 70% if they were generous, so 60. But then, if I was in the subprime in the States, they gave me 100%. So I was selling virtually, and they had both my house. When I bought here in Turin, they both had the house, but they also had my savings. This happened before inflation, so there's nothing criminal in what was done. But they were really too easy, happy-go-lucky. And in the middle, we have fraud, and we'll try now and understand what crimes were committed. What is the crime? I think you are well aware of the fact that people are greedy. Greed is one of the hallmarks of those who are involved in economics. Apparently, no one ever earns enough money, and I'm not talking about here and being pauperistic or favoring poverty, but the fact that a well-paid manager or executive should focus on wanting more and more and more and more and more, wanting more and more luxury is something totally mysterious to me, because you only have one life and it doesn't last all that long. You can't take more than something. You can't take anything with you when you die. So it's not as if you're going to make your children happy by leaving them a great wealth. Probably not. I'm a bit Calvinist in this respect, and I think that in Turin we're a bit like this. And in Venice they're not Calvinist, but I think they can understand very well what I'm about to say, because they had a republic, and the republic was able to, and Venice was able to manage this very carefully. Say I'm the manager of a rather happy-go-lucky company. I love a lot of subprime mortgages, but the market is slowing down, and because they're the first signs of a crisis. So somebody's going to start querying that AAA. So what do? My name is Terna. I will create a second company called Terna Bis. They're very legal and everything. I will use the credit from Terna, and I will create a Terna Bis, and I will put all the bad stock in the second company. So Pietro Terna is very successful because he sold everything. And then he runs away, leaving everybody in a mess. What I told you is a chain of crimes which actually happened. Well, there were also, for example, people who went bankrupt in all this process, making things very complicated. And at this point, people were getting very worried. And when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, people really got worried. The person who decided to bankrupt Lehman Brothers was a criminal, but they were ignorant criminals, because Wall Street Journal said, well, who has credits towards Lehman Brothers? The Europeans. Who cares? Let the Lehman Brothers go bankrupt. Then there are those who said that Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, was an enemy of Lehman Brothers chairman. Well, it went down, and the States before the US collapsed because no big bank can fail was a myth, and that myth just crumbled into nothing. 2008, at this point, Pietro Terna say wanted to buy a new car. But maybe I will decide not to change my car. I didn't lose a penny, but I said, wait a minute, manage your family, don't change the car. But the fact that I haven't bought a new car since then will certainly create problems for the car manufacturers. All of us behaved in the same way, and this, for example, affected Piedmont, not only for cars, because in Piedmont, we'll be talking about it later, for example, produces lasting goods. We produce suits like this. We manufacture these. We don't have these junk sort of clothes. If in a moment of crisis I decide to wait 2 years before I change my jacket, nothing will happen to me, but it will be a disaster for the textile industry. Think of the difficulties of the city of Biella in this respect, where I meet some of my former students in Biella, and they say, look, I'm unemployed, professor, can you help me? And these are people who used to find a job immediately. So the crisis is really affecting people. And Biella, it's getting even worse. And that was the relationship between a financial problem, which had not affected me, and the behavior that I had as a result of that crisis, which did have an impact, because we have to rediscover trust. Trust has got a cost. It is not a price. It's an attitude. It's feeling that we are not able, we're able to judge things more carefully, so they're not going to be able to trick us. I think we have to have trust, but we have to have trust maybe in somebody we trust. Yes, there's nothing to do with the elections, although the elections are around the corner. I would have said the same thing if there had been no elections running up. But I better change the subject. We're talking about Philips' computing machine, but to make laughing of it, let us try to understand with some major simplification. And I called it Turner's machine. And I then put there, a sort of negative comment. My machine is simplified, but never wrong. It says things that can be understood. I think that a lot of people work in banks, or that all of us have to do with banks. This is a very simplified balance and budget of a bank. Here you see we have credits, and this in terms of that was the assets, and as far as the liabilities are concerned, you have debts, and that's towards households and central banks. Towards other banks, but in particular towards the central banks, because when, for example, they ask for a loan from the central bank, the Bank of Italy, or whatever bank it is, they become debtors. They owe the central bank a certain amount of money. Credits, well, obviously they don't have a great cash flows, but credits are the loans which the bank makes, which can be good, very good. For example, there's some very good entrepreneurs who will invest then and create jobs, but they can be bad, not because the person necessarily, many entrepreneurs are still good, but they're having to close down. And I'm very sorry for them and for the workers who are being left home. But they look at small shops and retail sales. The situation is such that it's very difficult to cope, and then there are very bad credits. Here, this is a joke here. Usually politics has a bit to do with it. In any case, very bad credits, bad debts as they're called, become very big, and that's compounded by mistakes and fraud, having bought paper that is really bad, titles that are really bad. We did it less so than the French, the Germans, and the British, because the Germans are really up to it, because they bought bad debt more than we did. Now, I know that there's some criminal, the Bank of Siena has been involved in criminal fraud. I'm not talking about it because that's now the courts are dealing with it, and it's not a problem which economists can deal. They did things which were unprecedented, things which are against the interest of the people who were saving in the bank. Well, certainly there were also some CEOs that took advantage of this, but people reacted to this. They realized this. Think of yourself, for example. Let's go back to Lehman Brothers. They went bankrupt. This is another terrible story. The Bank of England subsequently admitted that it had underestimated the problem. They were convinced that the Northern Rock Bank would have managed to. They had no real cash flow, but I'll tell you what happened in a moment. And they said, well, let them manage, let them cope. Well, the morning after it didn't open, and they were the people who were queuing outside. And when it went bankrupt, it had more assets than liabilities. So if it had only been helped, it wouldn't have gone bankrupt. And the Bank of England subsequently admitted this. No other Central European bank made these mistakes, and I would like to praise them. I used to work with some people in the Bank of Italy in those years with simulations, and Dr. Bianucci worked. And as Dr. Bianucci was saying, we do simulations. In this case, it was payments among and between the treasurers of the banks to try and understand in the middle of the day or in the afternoon to see how we could expect the day to finish. Every day, the Bank of Italy assessed the situation, and in some days, on a morning, 6 or 7 billion, and you heard me properly, billion euros of cash were put into the system, and then the day after they were taken back. What happened, though? The Bank of Italy at one point, and I was there, called Saturday morning, convened all the Italian banks and said to them, do not desert the monetary market. Continue to loan to each other, because otherwise it'll all collapse like a pack of cards. And a friend of mine, who was the CEO of a small Piedmontese bank, saw me and says, yes, that's what they said, but from that day onwards, we didn't put €1 on the monetary market, on the currency market. Well, that's very nice. I said, a patriot. In fact, the Bank of Italy kept everything going with an operation that was extremely difficult, and I would like to praise them once again. We have parts of our government and state that are outstanding. Think of the Bank of Italy, but think of the value also of the President of the Republic. The President is the President, and he's a great person, but behind him there is an outstanding staff which contributed to hold us together, in holding us together. Well, let's go on with my drawing now. Households came afraid, and they fled banks. For example, somebody who was formerly a student of mine, I have students everywhere now because I'm elderly, and she said to me, you know that I realized that a lot of customers, she worked in a bank, come, then take their money out of the current account and put it in their safe box. So they were fleeing banks, but households had not increased their liquidity or cash flow. They just shifted it from one place to the other. And if we go back to the slide, they were not spending as much, although they had the same cash flow, as though liquidity was high. And they were not buying the public debt as they had before. This is something which we all did. I'm sure that all of you know this. And that this happened in the whole of the OECD. Less consumption meant lower income, and which meant lower level of consumption. And that meant the fear of the enterprise. This is the bad debt. The world of finance. This is the world of blood and tears, the real world, which gives us salaries, wages, that produces the things that we eat and wear, the world of our daily life. It's very important because it's the glue that keeps our society together. Yesterday, a journalist who's written a book on Greece said, currently in Greece, there is a shortage of drugs in chemists or pharmacies, only in the black market. Now we go to the pharmacy, we find everything we want. There's a certain difference. Luckily, we are still the head above water and not in the midst of a real catastrophe. What has happened? There's something which affected us. Since there was less public debt purchased, the state has less cash, a smaller cash flow, and has raised tax, less purchase of public debt, so I increase the rate. The Germans aren't doing it. And that is how you get the difference between the cost of our public debt, our government debt, and the German one, which we normally call spread, which, as you know, President Monti's grandson was called. He said so. He said that his grandson was being called "Hey, spread" at the nursery school, at the kindergarten. But that was not enough. We were now by 2011. Do you remember 2011? It felt as if the disaster was round the corner, and the euros should have collapsed, and it would have collapsed any moment. People speculated on the euro, but how do you do it? Well, what do you do? Well, for example, you say the Greeks, well, they won't solve it. Then there'll be the Spanish crisis, and then the Italian crisis. Ha, ha, ha. We're now going to sell our bonds in euros. We're going to sell euros. We'll get the price of the euro to drop, and then at a certain point, when it'll be very, very low, we'll purchase it back, we'll buy it back, and we will have earned billions of billions of billions, a bit like Uncle Scrooge, but it's very realistic in this case. But at that point, Mario Draghi, a rather powerful gentleman, came on the stage. Praise to him, great Italian. He convinced the Germans. It wasn't easy. And this is what he did. Let's go back to our slide. He flooded the banks with liquidity, with cash. Here you see this arrow. No, this other one. Here. At 1%, unlimited supply. An amount of money one can't imagine, unimaginable. Saying you can use something for the real economy. Unfortunately, the Italian banks used too little. So enterprises and businesses, even the ones that would like to invest, have a liquidity crisis, but purchase the public debt, purchase the bonds, the T-bonds. And that means that every time there was some of the public debt, the T-bonds on sale, things went well. I think we saved the euro, especially because international speculators luckily lost a lot of money on this. And Angela Merkel, too, has changed her mind. She was against this type of agreement. Germany always voted against it, but Angela Merkel, at one point, she's a great stateswoman, and she said, the markets are harming our population. Our peoples. Very important. Markets must be neutral. What is a market? Well, market's the thing downstairs where there are stalls. If I'm a purchaser, I buy salad, and if I'm a farmer, I sell salad. It's a place of exchange. It's not where you speculate. These people who bet against the euro currently have lost a lot of money. So be it. They'd earned a lot too. Serves them right. Praise to Mario Draghi, but that's not enough, because we saved the situation, fine, and now we have to ask ourselves whether there'll be inflation. I think, and many believe, that this won't happen because this liquidity has not entered the real economy. A bit of it should, because we certainly need a bit of recovery. So we need a bit of this to have investments, to have consumption. Don't forget the appeal by Keynes when on the radio, halfway through the 1929 depression, he said something which became famous, and he said, "Heroic British housewives, it's up to you to save the nation." There were other days, and it was another time, but we had radios, and that message was virtually like a war bulletin, a bit like what the king had to say when the war broke out. One of the greatest economists. He was made Lord, he was very young in recognition. This great liquidity is in the imaginary circuit, or false circuit, false in the sense that it's not real circuit, finance, but certainly we have no fear of an inflation as the one we had in the 70s, so we shouldn't really be afraid of it, nor should the Germans be afraid of it. In Germany, I have a very strong opinion there. I have a hope. I'm not talking about the politics of Germany, but the economy. But what happened in the meanwhile? Lots of other effects. Look, this is what happened in Italy. This is quarter after quarter after quarter. Here's 2008. This is where we are. And it's the trend of our GDP. The GDP is a magical word. This is the amount of goods we produce. And on the basis of this, we generate the money for wages and salaries. It could be done for an enterprise, for a business, for a country, for part of a country. It dropped, and then here we were deluded into believing that it was going to get better, but it wasn't. And you see, we're waiting for signs of recovery. The U.S. had been quite successful because in the course of the presidency, when the Treasury had helped the incumbent, but now they have a big problem of deficit. It's not quite clear how they're going to work their way out of it, and hopefully the two parties will find a middle ground. But this is a very bad sign, and this is another one. These are yearly fluctuations in the world. This is 1990, this is now, and the world in the past few years has been kept afloat by developing countries. Some of them are ginormous, Brazil, India, China, or the dark blue is the variation. And it has to do with the dynamics or the engine of the developing countries. The developed countries are in light blue, very negative, and certainly they haven't stocked up with the help from the developing world. And things are not going too well. Here we're in 2011. 2012 is a bit worse than 2011. So the problem is not an Italian problem, it's a problem which concerns the world as a whole. The Eurozone has experienced a drop in GDP. That's the black bar. Fall in investments. if you don't invest, you don't innovate. Innovation is the driving force of the economy. It's what creates a space for youngsters. There was a wonderful sentence, Draghi said it, maybe I'm overquoting him, but Draghi says the economy is not developing because youngsters aren't finding work. This is the other way around, because usually people say young people are not finding work because the economy is not recovering. But youngsters bring enthusiasm, see problems in a different way. If youngsters are outside and they haven't got any permanent jobs, they're not going to bring any ideas, and they're not going to offer their knowledge and their enthusiasm. Let's go back a bit to this slide here, just to say that consumption has been negative. Export, yes, Europe has exported, mainly Germany, but Italy too has still exported. There are some things. And the public administration, that is my employer, has kept things afloat by expanding government consumption. And then somebody says, no, we have to cut government consumption. Yes, you have to cut it, but it's not the best moment now. And I don't want to see other former student of mine walking the streets unemployed. This is not the moment to do that. But this would be a subject for another conference, so I'm going to just keep it here. Markets and the spread. The markets are the transmission belt. The speculation has taken advantage of mistakes. This is an opinion of mine. You can disagree, but if we had blocked the Greek situation, it would have cost 30 billion euros. For me, it's an impossible sum, but on the European Union level, it's nothing. It's a drop in the sea. Now, we've already spent 340, and we haven't blocked it. And we didn't block it immediately because the Germans said 9. The Greeks made a mistake. The Greeks must pay. We will not intervene. Wonderful. So if I'm a speculator, I'll certainly play against the Greeks. Of course, I'll win. The right answer is the one which Draghi gave in 2012. Said, you want to play against the euro? Do it. We will answer with unlimited amounts. It says this is not included in the European Bank. They voted. Only Germany was against it, and they proceeded. I think in Draghi, these were really dramatic moments. And you need a certain strength to be able to withstand that. Merkel and Draghi. The spread now has shrunk a little. It's still quite substantial, but over the past year we have been recognized in the international markets because we haven't made any more mistakes. We are now on the attack. We play football, but with our technique, people won in the 60s. And we used to play next to the goalie. Now you don't do it. You've got to attack. You've got to play differently. Who's doing this? All the European countries, and we'll see what the role of Italy and Germany is. But this is particularly true. We have to play with the strongest of the European countries, that is, say, Germany. What if, should Germany just shrug its shoulders because Italy, Spain, and Greece are in trouble? Its main customers are in Italy and France. It's not a good idea to kill your customers, is it? We're all in the same boat. The euro is keeping us together. If some people have more disadvantage than others, there are two possibilities. Say, if the two of us stand up, one is taller than the other, there are two things. You can either cut the legs of the taller, or you can get the shorter one to be raised. Germany has less inflation. The cost of labor is low in Germany. Right, well then why don't they raise wages? The trade unions are asking for it. The German trade unions And I hope that here in Turin, they will be able to invite the Secretary General of IG Metall, a great trade union. In the moment of the crisis, they said, right, we'll work longer hours for the same wages. But now they're saying, excuse me, at this point we want a salary or wage increase. And Germany is a great market for us, so it's very important. So if Germany starts moving, we can also benefit from it. This is what they're discussing in the secret rooms, the back rooms of Europe, because when they come out, they sort of pat each other on the back and smile and speak to the press, but in the back rooms, they're talking about the future. This is something to increase trust, but we should try and find some trust too. Now, and I'm nearly finished, but I would like to have time for questions. Well, first of all, there's the problem of government or state debt. This is a big problem. This is the debt in Italy. And you can see World War I, World War II, the terrible inflation, then the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Part of the 80s, this is the deficit we were spending then, but we were passing the debt on to the future generation. We were spending, but how can you change? Professor Castellino, whom some of you will remember, great economist who died quite young. He was 70, and 70 is young. In the 70s, Professor Castellino, so long before now, nobody was listening to him, but he said we should slow down because we wouldn't manage. And a great politician of the time said, but when will the problem arise? 2005. He said, ooh, don't worry. Who cares about 2005? Somebody else will be there. Yes, we're here. Now it's 2013. Recently, as you've seen, the debt has increased. Well, one of the reasons is that if you have an economic crisis, it increases. Think of the redundancy funds. People made redundant. That causes problems. Inflation increases because of two reasons. Either because the GDP decreases or because expenses increases. According to Europe, we should go below this line, but with a long way. But the important thing to do is, and we will to see that we've balanced the books. Yes, we balanced the books, but you know the famous joke, the treatment was successful. Unfortunately, the patient died, but it's his fault or her fault. I'm not criticizing our health system, because personally I owe to the health systems, health system a lot. But it was just, it was an old joke on doctors. So we must be rigorous, but at the same time, let's try and avoid rigor mortis. That is to say, we need a bit of funding to the business world. We have to help households, and we have to give a bit of tax deduction. We have to do it and quickly, so that fewer shops will close down, fewer businesses will close down. This is not impossible. You must do it, be careful, and knowing that while Germany should drive the economy, because otherwise there'll be another disaster, because we're all tied to the euro. You know that the same experiment was carried out in the 19th century when Italy was unified. In fact, southern Italy got the lira, our northern lira. Southern Italy had a flourishing industry, but their level of productivity was lower. Once there was no longer the currency difference, the southern industry melted down and disappeared. Are we going to make the same mistake? Does history not teach us anything? I think that a lot of people nowadays are well aware of this problem. let us go back to our drawings. Let us see what the world outlook is. The light blue bars. This is what economists estimate will be the relative situation compared to the US GDP in 45 years. That's very distant. No, it isn't. We were talking about the 70s to 2013. Italy is not seen as an area which will develop, but we're not that badly off, are we? If the situation goes back to normal, then people will have enough to eat, have a house, and if we're not greedy, the situation is relatively satisfactory, and the rest of the world goes on. It's not possible to have a world of unequals. There's still the big question mark of Africa, but Africa too is giving signs of change and of reawakening. For example, Greece is not very far off from Italy. Do you remember a few years ago when we were saying Italy is in fact being surpassed, overtaken by Greece and Spain? Well, I just like my situation to be acceptable, and I hope other people are well off too. India recovers, but it's if you look at the GDP now, I mean, poverty is enormous. Most people are poor. China explodes, but again, it's not a great situation which it has now. There are 200 million of wealthy people, but there's 1.2 billion of people below the poverty line. They don't have enough food. And then China, in any case, has a population bomb, which is very dangerous because China had the one-child policy. What does that mean? That every two, there's one. And that's not great, because at that point, suddenly you have a lot of elderly people and no young people. And who's going to look after the elderly? I mean, I'm interested in this because at some point I would like somebody to look after me. Is anyone thinking, well, there are the Romanians maybe who'll come? Yes, it was fluke, really, luck, to their disadvantage, because these people at one point will go back. They too will have a right to development. They too will have a right to go back. They've given us outstanding help. There are workers, mainly women, because there are many more women than men, and they've been very, very good. But it's a transient situation. It can't last forever. And then I will have a final for Professor Mayo. Maybe he'll hit me. I'll be talking about technologies and technology. Right. So we're moving. Let's see what we're... Then here we have world trade and the Chinese engine. Countries such as China, because China is an enigma for us. We don't really understand it. It's the last communist country in the world, but there's never been a country that has been so uncontrollably capitalist. There's never have been. But it's communist. China, it is true that it exports a lot. You can see it here. This is the foreign content. Of their exports. So most of what it exports, it also imports and processes, while the US exports a lot. So this is absolute values, but they don't import much. So they're not just a transmission chain for the other countries of the world, but China is. China 15 years ago was frightening. I've always told people who said that it will kill all the industries of the world, didn't know what they were saying, because if they want to sell to us, they must purchase from us too. They can't, in fact, have one-way trade. Trade is an exchange. In any case, at the beginning of the 19th century, Ricardo, an economist, explained it to us. So if you didn't know, everything's been explained. But innovation is necessary. And this is where I'm going to start provoking Professor Mayo. Professor Mayo was a great innovator, so he knows these things. This is a graph that The Economist recently published, and it's very interesting and opened my eyes at the great innovations that have changed the world. Now let's start with what? Steam engine. Yes. Then there was the steam locomotive. Then the telegraph. Then the electric generators. Then something which I'd never thought of, indoor plumbing. Indoor plumbing changed the world. My mother, around about 1922-23 of the last century, suffered from typhus because the water was contaminated with the black waters, with the sanitation. And the typhus caused problem for the rest of her life because if there was no treatment. If the person was survived, that was fine. But if they didn't, they just used to put cold pads on the head. If you weren't so strong enough, you didn't survive. We now consider the fact that you switch the light on as you get home, you go to the bathroom, you flush the toilet, you solve that problem. You then fill up a saucepan full of drinking water. It all seems to be self-evident, but in countries that are now developed, it really is is really incredible. Then there was radio broadcast transmission, and then the personal computer. And The Economist didn't put computers, which appeared in the 1940s. Which was roughly when Hiroshima had the bomb, but the personal computer, that is to say, what really changed our world. And here you can see it, which is in our phone. But there are no mobile phones. What we really need is the new innovation, the new discovery. And I have my personal opinion on this. One personal opinion is I'm nearly elderly. Well, technically, I'm over 65, but thanks to the health system in Italy, I'm okay. My father, at my age, wasn't as fit as I am. We were roughly made in the same way. Maybe I ate a bit better than him, but not really a lot, because I was born during the war, so I certainly didn't. I'm a bit just a shorty, and we were eating the leftovers, but I was sort of patched up by the health system. So I'm an elderly person, but a healthy elderly person, but I'm going to defend our interests. Elderly people need young people to look after them. Youngsters who can also use robots. So I think that one of the great innovations which will come in the world are the caring robots, meaning robots used for personal care. But if anyone had imagined in 1990 that now internet was going to be something that I've got my phone and I'm connected with the world, millions of computers, I can talk to anybody in the world, people would have thought I was completely stark raving mad. And we will have computers in robots. They will be androids looking like people beings. They won't. But in many houses, we already have automatic hoovers. They're simple robots, aren't they? The other important innovation is the so-called 3D printer, which is not a printer. It's a machine that produces objects. So there's a book that's just been published, translated in Italian. It's very cheap, and it's called Makers. Makers, the ones who make. And which explains that in a matter of a few years, the innovations linked to the fact that there will be 3D printers will change the way in which you produce. The Economist described a violin that was printed 3 ways. And the violin works. Certainly it's not a Stradivari, but it's a violin and it works. And I was telling a student today at home, the first printer came in 1985. Very primitive object. It cost a fortune and it was continuous. Now I have a very cheap printer and I print photos and they're beautiful. So now the first 3D ones are very complicated, but sooner or later it'll get better. These are my 2 hopes. I don't know what will happen, because usually if you make a forecast, you get wrong. Will we be there? But yes. Look at these slides very rapidly. They come from 3 different editions of Eurostat. Eurostat is the book of statistics for Europe, for the European Union. These are the regional yearbooks. I had to use 3 because not all the data are aligned. Let us now see the elderly. We have to start thinking about the elderly. The darker the picture, the more the elderly. Liguria is for Piedmont also have a lot of elderly people, but not everywhere in Italy. We are able to replace the population. Migrants are helping us, but they're not enough. And then sooner or later they might go home. They will go home, and the French experience show that the population trends amongst migrants are become the same as the resident population or the population that was there before them. Again, I'm very interested in the topic. Then there's migration. The yellow, darker areas are areas people migrate to, and the blue ones are where people migrate from. It's a transient phenomenon, which determines a rebalancing. Italians used to emigrate. They went to Germany, to the United States, but they don't emigrate anymore. Well, when we look at our brothers from other nations, don't forget that other nations look down on Italians. Migrants bring us the wealth of their training that took place somewhere else. I teach microeconomics in the evening class, and I have a lot of students who attended high school in their countries of origin, and they usually have very good training. Maths is very often better than ours. And now what they're doing with their human resources is they're serving or offering it to our country rather than the country of origin. They will graduate here. Last year, the best student came from Cameroon, but the most lively person asking the right questions and answering the right question is a woman who comes from Russia. Very interesting. She stimulates all the others. Very beautiful, very interesting. So migrants will help us, but it's transient. This is the disaster area, the English too, the British too, but I don't care. This is education. Our youngsters do not study enough, and this is one of Professor Meo's favorite topics. You went to Biella many years ago saying you're moving towards disaster, you're heading for it, and they said no. Why was he saying that? Because in Biella people didn't study. They found jobs at 16. Now they have a legion, or in fact legions and legions of 50-year-olds who are very good very good textile workers, but don't know how to do anything else, and it's a disaster. This is a figure for under 17s age. This means that a lot of youngsters don't study, don't complete their education, don't complete their secondary education. This is the worst thing that I've had to show you this evening. My aim is that to have as many youngsters as possible who should be enthusiastic about what they're learning. Unemployment. Now, we have lots of unemployed, but less than other people, or fewer than other people. Germany and Northern Italy are better off. We're not happy about it. We don't gloat at other people's failures, but don't think that we're the ones in the worst situation. It's a European problem. So we have to convince powerful Germany that it's its duty to realize that there are all these people. And we are not in such a bad condition. Of course, southern Italy needs a bit of a shake-up. There's a statistics that is included in the newspaper by a journalist yesterday. I can't remember it, but I can email it if anybody's needed. That shows that if there were a separate budget and balance for southern Italy, would be worse off than Greece. I don't belong to the Northern League, far from it, but this is a fact. And then, just one positive note. Where is Europe thriving? Where there's grey. central and northern Italy, and Germany. Europe needs industry and tertiary industry, manufacturing and service industries. And this is where the gray areas are. So let's not cry over milk that hasn't been spilt. We can manage. I'm not saying that tomorrow morning we'll be able to pick up. I'm not going to tell you that it'll work in 2013. If I were to say that, I would invent. I can say, I said to you what I think can be done to hope to rekindle the Italian economy and get the Germans to rekindle theirs and give citizens more trust so they should not be petrified. And economists, is it their fault? Well, mostly it is. I think you'll leave here today saying that they certainly weren't very nice to us. Are they all bad? Well, maybe not. But first of all, let me tell you what I'm doing. Dr. Bianucci was saying earlier on that I produced simulation models. This is true. This is a recent model of The Economist, January the 19th, so very recent. Here we have three economists, Professor Fornero, Monterbo, and another economist, Professor De Aglio, I don't know, or Professor Mayer, who are looking at their macroeconomic bank, but what is weighing on their shoulders? An elephant which is a bank, because the problems are the banks. Paper. And we're going to have to find a way out of it. Now we've kept everything under lock and key, but sooner or later we've got to do something, because a little bit sort of emerges with criminal code. The Monte dei Paschi di Siena is certainly not comparable to the situation in other Italian banks. It is a very big problem which will have to be solved or addressed. The Economist says that the great models that explain how the economy works, and which in the past 10 years have become a refined version of a model of general economic balance, have to become dynamic. They were, well, at the end of the 19th century, they explained it in a static manner, while now it has to be explained as it develops over time. So they're called a dynamic model. It has to also take into consideration shocks, and therefore it has to be stochastic. They're called DSGEM. That is to say, the stochastic general economic model. And they're starting to include banks. But not only, they're starting to introduce simulation models. Using the simulation models, which I believe in, I've been working on it for 20 years, to try and recreate in the computer this. An economist tells us that this can be a solution. A colleague who's very knowledgeable, more than I am, explained to me what the new model army means. I thought it meant, well, an army of new models. No, historically, this is the name of Cromwell's army. The parliamentarians had a new model army that fought the royalists. And it's very, very interesting, because I studied it. So the new model army is the new army with all the new means to fight the evils of economy, including this is the Alvin Roth and Lloyd Shapeley discovery. Both worked with colleagues who in the meantime have died, so they were not included in the Nobel Prize. But one of the tendencies or recent trends of the Nobel Prize is they award it to elderly people, although this was not the original intention, because it was originally, the idea was for people who were working to have the means to progress in their career. Well, although people who are awarded prizes, the Nobel laureates, tend to devolve their money to their study. These are mathematicians, and in particular Shapley's a mathematician, the other was more an economist, but Shapeley's a mathematician, and they adopt the mathematical techniques and to solve the problems of matching. Say, when I go to buy salad has a price. If it's too expensive, I won't buy the salad. And then tomorrow, probably the price will have come down. because they've understood that if it was overpriced, so prices rebalance. But, for example, to find the doctors and the best hospital for the doctors and the doctors for the best hospital is very difficult. How can we decide which is the best doctor for that? Not that there are doctors that are not good, but the best one for that hospital. How do you... Well, their method, which is mathematically perfect, works. Well, of course, just a bit to amuse themselves, they also did it with matchmaking. And they explained that with their formulas, they can get men and women to be matched in a certain nation. Then if there's any question, it's a game. They applied it to very diverse things. For example, one is how you can match patients and donors, which is certainly very important. I'm a friend of the professor who was in charge of this. He died very young, and he said, for me, the tragedy is when I have one kidney and two patients. Mathematics to solve it. Are you mad? No, well, mathematics will help us see to it that everybody's a bit better off, even students in schools. How can you do this in the best possible way? How can students find the best school for them? Economies and economics and the economists do not only study the Homo economicus. I would like to conclude saying that our forefather Adam Smith, who didn't know he was an economist, he lived in the 1700s, and so if they'd asked him what his job was, he would have said, I'm a philosopher. Technically, he was a moral philosopher. He's best known for his book on the wealth of nations, but in fact his most important work was on moral sentiments and feelings, which was based on altruism. So economists are not only rather coarse people, and if you're interested, you can go to the link and download the slides. Thank you very much, Professor Terna.
Grazie.